When the Great War started in 1914, Canada also joined the war under the arm of the British Empire. Roughly 66,000 of the 650,000 Canadian soldiers would lose their lives, and 175,000 would be wounded by the end of the war. Almost 100 years after the end of the Great War, a game development studio called DICE would release a game called Battlefield 1, a game created to replicate many of the largest and most brutal battles in the First World War. Although the gameplay is not entirely accurate to what the actual fighting was like, it does an excellent job of teaching players about the First World War. The game is chocked full of codex entries describing battles, vehicles, and the guns of the Great War. Within Battlefield 1, there is a game mode called Operations, and before the operation begins, you're kind of told some history of why the operation is happening, who planned it, and what the fighting is possibly going to look like.
On the anniversary of their humiliating defeat at Caporetto, the Italian army launched a huge assault to win back the land they had lost from the now well-prepared Austro-Hungarians. This would be the ultimate test for both of these courageous armies.
When the match begins, you will get the perspective of a soldier for the side you're fighting on. They'll talk about what they'll do if they win, if they're worried, their thoughts on the enemies, stuff like that.
Non dimenticheremo mai l'indelebile vergogna causata al paese dalla disfatta di Caporetto. Oggi possiamo lenire quel dolore, riconquistando le terre cadute sotto il giogo degli invasori asburgici. Prega per me, mamma. Prega per il Regno d'Italia.
The game overall, while of course not being perfect, is very believable and gives players the idea of how these battles took place and why they took place. When the match ends, you're told what happened if the side who won landed on the right side of history, and what could have happened if the other side had won.
The Italian victory, known as the Vittorio Veneto, brought an end to the war on the Italian front and resulted in the complete collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This also meant the war on the Western Front would soon come to an end. One can only speculate what an Austro-Hungarian victory would have meant for the future of Europe. It is possible success could have united the crumbling empire, allowing the Habsburgs to keep control of their countries, races, and ethnicities for at least a few months longer.
All is done in service of teaching players about the First World War and the events that took place. Personally, I think DICE has done amazing work. The amount of time and care gone into giving each player as much information as possible is truly something DICE should be proud of. This game is made to remember those who fought and died, so we may never forget their bravery in the face of death.
They push, we push. Every once in a while, we push hard enough that the light breaks through the clouds, and a world beyond the war glimmers, just out of reach. The war is the world, and the world is the war. But behind every gun sight is a human being. We are those people. We are the jaded, and we are the naive. We are the honorable and the criminal. We are the bound for legend and the lost to history. We are the knights of the sky, the ghosts in the desert, and the rats in the mud. These are our stories.
Now, there's not really an easy way to say this, so unfortunately, I'm going to be very blunt about this. For all the perspectives and countries that Battlefield 1 represents in the game, they fail to mention one of the strongest, one of the bravest, and one of the most important countries in the First World War, Canada. Now, before I discuss why their lack of inclusion is a huge mistake, I have to talk about why Canada's significance is important in terms of discussing the First World War. Canada was involved in 8 campaigns during the First World War. Those include the Second Battle of Ypres, the Battle of the Somme, and Passchendaele, to name a few. Each of those battles and campaigns that Canada fought in, they were known as being exceptionally strong and very fearful for the enemy side. The Second Battle of Ypres saw Germans nail the Allied forces with a new weapon, mustard gas. The Canadian division in St. Julien was hit particularly hard, being hit non-stop by shrapnel, gas, and machine gun fire. Yet despite this, the Canadian troops were able to hold the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. In the Battle of the Somme, there was a tremendous loss of life. In total, 1 million soldiers died, so the Allies could take only about 8 kilometers of land. Passchendaele is the closest Earth has ever gotten to a personification of hell. The land was extremely muddy and the battlefield was awful for trench warfare. Yet somehow the Allies, including the Canadians, prevailed and took land that probably should have been left to waste. Canada's role in Gallipoli was mainly put in the hands of the Newfoundland Regiment, which upon arrival would be met with constant shellings and would experience this for their entire time in Gallipoli. Although they fought exceptionally hard themselves, as well as with the rest of the Allied forces, they would unfortunately have to retreat. Despite this, July 1st, also known as Canada Day, is a great day of celebration for Newfoundlanders for their sacrifice and their bravery in Gallipoli. The Battle of Hill 70 was fought during a larger battle called the Battle of Lens. During Hill 70, the Canadians had to defend it against German attackers. The Germans started by nailing Canadian troops with non-stop gas, and although the gas did deal damage, it wasn't enough to deter Canadian defenders. Any German troops that eventually did reach the Canadian defense line would be beat to death, either by hand combat or by stones or bricks or whatever was nearby. Hand-to-hand combat was very common, especially during this battle, and Canada showed they were no slouch. Eventually, the Germans had to accept their losses and were forced to retreat. All of these are battles Canada had fought in which Canada was very important and had a huge influence on a lot of these battles. Well, despite this, Canada has such little representation in Battlefield 1, I wouldn't be surprised if most players didn't even know that Canada fought in World War I. As stated in the introduction to this video, Battlefield 1 has a system called Codex entries, which describe the vehicles, weapons, armies, and battles that took place during the Great War. There are a total of 311 Codex entries in the game, and there are only 2 Codex entries in the entire game that describe Canada in any capacity. Those are the Codex entries for the Ross rifle, a rifle manufactured in Canada and used by the Canadian Armed Forces for around half of the First World War, and the Colonial Troops Codex entry, in which mention the armies who were under the British during the First World War. This is the extent of which Canada is even mentioned in the entire game. There are no soldiers fighting for the British military with a Canadian flag on their arm or Canadian uniforms. In fact, there are 25 maps in Battlefield 1 covering battles from many different locations during World War I, some even after. And of those 29 maps, Canada and Newfoundland fought in 6 of them. 8 if you count Gallipoli, but Newfoundland was in a different location from where many of the Gallipoli maps take place. Well, anyway, in those 6 maps, Canada, of course, has 0 mention. In comparison, India had a much smaller role in the First World War. Although they deployed more troops, they mainly fought in Northern Africa and the Middle East, and they didn't really have much contact on the Western Front. But that didn't stop DICE from giving India the Medic class, in which they're given a turban, which DICE themselves have confirmed is the Indian soldier, and they are represented in almost every single map that Britain is mentioned in. Anzac, better known as the Australian New Zealand Military Corps, largely fought in Gallipoli. Anzac is very well represented in Battlefield 1, since they have an entire DLC and an entire war story via the single-player campaign in which you play as an Anzac soldier. And they get representation in the form of the medic as well during the Gallipoli maps, and they get the same hat and the same insignia as an Anzac soldier for the Recon class. The final DLC of Battlefield 1 is called Apocalypse, which included the most brutal battles of World War I, which included the Battle of the Somme and Passchendaele. Quite literally the perfect opportunity to add Canada in the game in the form of adding a unique look for a certain class, but no, we got nothing. So a lot of this is quite strange, but it is nothing nearly as bad as DICE straight up ignoring the most important victory to not only Canada, but some of the Allies' most important victories during the Great War, Vimy Ridge. Vimy is a small town in France. On its own, it's nothing important, but the land surrounding Vimy is what makes it so important. The land around Vimy is plentiful with mountains that provide a strategic advantage as there is a great view over the local French landscape. The Germans at the start of the war had taken it and held onto it for quite a while, for 3 years in fact. Over the course of those 3 years, the British and the French would launch several invasions to take back Vimy Ridge, but they were unsuccessful in doing so, costing the lives of 250,000 troops. So it's easy to assume that Canada was under a lot of pressure when British High Command had sent the Canadian military to Vimy Ridge to take the hill and accomplish what 250,000 soldiers had failed to do so before them. All 4 of Canada's military divisions were placed to take back Vimy. The first time this had ever happened during the Great War, this was a Canadian operation. This was their time to shine. And shine they did. Canada's 4 divisions, which combined reached around 100,000 troops, managed to take Vimy Ridge in 3 days, with about 3,000 dead and 7,000 wounded. This was a huge victory, not only for Canada, but for the Allies as well. Vimy gave them a height advantage and an amazing sightline across northern France and a little bit of Belgium as well. This battle was one of the defining factors in Canada becoming an independent nation and was a huge source of Canadian patriotism after the First World War. And this battle, despite its importance, does not appear in Battlefield 1. In fact, Vimy Ridge is not mentioned at all in any of the codex entries within Battlefield 1. Would it really be too fucking hard to add Vimy Ridge in the Apocalypse DLC? God forbid DICE adds Canada for one fucking map as a way to show their appreciation for Canada's accomplishments in the same way they do for every other country. It wouldn't even be that hard necessarily. Just change the character models for the British soldiers a bit. Is that really too much to ask? Apparently so. It's also too much to add a Canadian flag to the British recon troops for certain maps, or to simply mention Canada to be a part of the battles in the fucking codex. But no, nothing at all. No, in fact, DICE is more focused on 2 battalions that had a total of 3,400 soldiers in them because it will give them more brownie points rather than representing countries for not simply existing, but for their accomplishments and what those soldiers sacrificed their lives for. And that is how Battlefield failed a nation. Now, I don't want to end this on such a somber and extreme note. So if you found anything here interesting and you want to learn more about Canada's involvement in the First World War, the top link in the description will bring you to the Government of Canada website, giving descriptive details on events and battles Canada's military was involved in. And if you want to learn more about the Great War in general, take a look at the second link in the description, which will bring you to a documentary called Doomsday, a documentary covering the largest events of World War I. Now, although I've said some pretty harsh things about Battlefield 1, it's still an excellent game and an excellent way to teach you about the First World War. So if you haven't, I'd highly recommend you pick up the game and you play it. It's also just a ton of fun in general, like I genuinely loved the game. So, despite DICE's failure to remember the fallen, we must remember those who died, so their deaths are not in vain. They may be gone, but they will never be forgotten.
One day, all this will be over. The war to end all wars will be won by one side or the other. The guns will rust, grass will grow, and there'll be nothing left of any of this. The land will heal itself, as everything does in the end. We'll be long gone by then, but maybe not forgotten. History only remembers 1 in 1,000 of us. Then the future will be filled with stories of who we were and what we did, how we lived, how we fought, and how we died. When this is all over and the war is won, they will remember us. But until that day comes, we will stand. We will look death in the eye. And we will fight.
Thank you for watching.